Once upon a time, I was a lonely poor guy. It all started when I met this wise man. What happened was my life was changed overnight. Hi guys, my name is Arash, and in this video I want to teach you how to use expressions to tell a story like a native to attract everyone. We want to learn how to talk about our last weekend events, when we went on a vacation to our friends, giving details about something that happens in a job interview, talking about your childhood memories to your children or your friends, and telling colleagues about what happened on a business trip. To learn to tell a story like a native, follow me in this video. In this video, we learn expressions about beginning a story, such as "I never forget the time that it all started with," or "in a city that reminds me of when I've got to tell you about." Then we learn expressions about continuing a story, such as "what happened," "the next thing we know," "so later on," and "meanwhile." Going back in a story or adding facts about a story. "The thing you have to know, I forgot to mention that. The other thing is, all there is to know about." And we learn expressions on how to end a story, to make a long story short. So finally, now let's read a shorter story. Pay attention to the use of these expressions. We were driving to a camping vacation. It all started when we were singing along with this cool music. We didn't pay attention to the signs. The next thing we knew, we made a wrong turn. I forgot to mention that we hadn't had enough gas to make it back to our route. So later on, we reached a deserted town. The thing you have to know is, nobody lived there and we were helpless. Up until then, of course, I'm not gonna talk about this structure up until then in this video, but maybe in another video. I hadn't been lost in such a scary place. To make a long story short, we had to walk to the main route and ask for help. Now let's learn the expressions we need to begin a story. These expressions are: I never forget the time that it all started with, or "in a city that reminds me of when I've got to tell you about," and "to begin." We are using these expressions to help the audience to sequence the events in their minds, what happened first in their story, and what happened next, and what happened at last. So these expressions are used for beginning a story. In the beginning, or at the beginning of. All the expressions in this slide mean the same: in the beginning or at the beginning of. For example, at the beginning of the video, I was trying to pay attention, but now I'm distracted. I never forget the time that we are starting a story, we are beginning to tell a story. I never forget the time that I went to paint some graffiti on the walls in that deserted town with a few freaks. Like a father telling their childhood memories to their children. I never forget the time that something special happened in the past, like when you were a child. There is a story, there is an incident, memory. And you can't forget that time when something special happened. It all started with me running into her on the campus. This is a love story. That was when we met first. It all started with. You're talking about how your story began. It all started when you hit the subscribe button, and that is how our story began. Next, that reminds me of when I got down with flu means I was infected with flu in that cold winter. That makes me remember, that makes me think about the time I got down with flu. That reminds me. I've got to tell you about how I became a football coach. You can also say, did I ever tell you about how I became a football coach? Did I ever tell you about? You can ask this statement expression in a question form. Now, number 2, continuing a story. What happened or had happened? The next thing we know, so later on, or meanwhile, and wouldn't you know it? These are similar to then, after that, right after. Right after I switched the light on, my wife shoved the cake in my face. For example, it was a birthday surprise. Next, as soon as, later, soon after, shortly after I got home, I went to bed. Now these are a little more professional and more native expressions for your stories. Let's get down to them and read some examples. Examples. What happened was the king was murdered by the rebellious army. What happened was, or sometimes what had happened was, is used to start a story or provide a context for a situation that has already occurred. To provide a context. So it is used to start a story or provide a context. And what happened was, it has a light-hearted tone. It has a humorous tone. What happened was the king was murdered so... it means the king was murdered so easily. It adds a humorous tone or light-hearted tone to the story. The next thing we know, we were absolutely lost in the forest. The next thing we know suggests that a situation that we are describing is surprising. The next thing we know means after that, something surprising happened. Maybe because it happened so suddenly. The next thing we know, we were absolutely lost in the forest. Surprising and sometimes suddenly. I leaned over, and the next thing I knew, I felt a terrible pain on my back. I felt a terrible pain on my back. Suddenly and surprisingly. The next thing we know, the next thing I know, the next thing you know. So far, 2 examples. And then, so later on, means it's used for continuing a story. So later on, the queen and a consort, royal husband. The queen and a consort attended the banquet, attended the celebration. So later on means after that, to refer to a time, to a situation, after the one that you have been talking about, after that. Next. So later on, the poor people of France sent the nobleman to guillotine. This is from A Tale of Two Cities written by Charles Dickens. We have this story in my channel, you can follow that in 13 chapters. So later on, something happened after another thing. So later on, the poor people of France sent the nobleman to guillotine. And now, meanwhile. Meanwhile means in the intervening period of time. In the intervening period of time. In that period of time. The party starts at 8. Meanwhile, find somewhere to sit until the rest of the guests arrive. This doesn't have a story tone, but pay attention to the use of meanwhile here. Meanwhile, in that period of time, in the intervening period of time, the party is at 8. Meanwhile, it is not 8 now. From now until 8, find somewhere to sit until the rest of the rest of the guests arrive. Meanwhile, I picked up my son on my way home. Meanwhile, in that period of time, or while something else was happening, we can also translate it in this way. While something else was happening, I picked up my son on my way home. More examples on meanwhile. He has said a little, meanwhile, about how he plans to catch his partner on the hop. To catch somebody on the hop means to surprise someone. To catch someone on the hop means surprise someone. Meanwhile. Now we use meanwhile in the middle of a sentence, not at the beginning or at the end. I knew I wouldn't get my visa for several weeks, and I wasn't sure what to do in the meanwhile. Now meanwhile here comes at the end of the sentence with the same meaning. Meanwhile is a synonym to meantime here. I know I wouldn't get my visa in several weeks. I wasn't sure what to do in the meantime, in that period of time. These several weeks, in that period of time. And this was the usage of meanwhile. Now going back in a story, the thing you have to know, I forgot to mention that, the other thing is all there is to know about. While using these expressions, we want to refer to a point in our story and add a little details or facts about our story. Like, the thing you have to know is, it was me who acted as a go-between, means liaison, go-between, between these two quarreling friends, to make peace between these two quarreling friends. You bring up something that you didn't refer to initially. You bring up something new. All there is to know about the stone, all there is to know about. You are bringing up something important about the stone. We found in the cave is that it is priceless. I'm going to refer to an important fact about the stone. The stone we found in cave is that it is priceless. I forgot to mention that the project was at its initial stage and we didn't know what the outcome would be. I'm referring to a fact that maybe I should have said it earlier. I don't have equipment for mountain climbing. The other thing is that I'm afraid of heights. Now, we use the other thing is to introduce a new idea. One idea is, I don't have equipment for mountain climbing. The other thing is, I'm introducing a new idea. I'm afraid of heights. The other thing is that the political campaign was so divisive. I was talking about the features of political campaign in my story, and now the other aspects about it, the other feature of the political campaign was, or is, that it was so divisive. And how to end your story professionally, to make a long story short, and so finally, yes, you can say finally, eventually, consequently, in the end, you can use all of these for ending your story. To make a long story short, she broke up with me without any reason. As a sum up, you're providing just basic facts rather than giving a lengthy explanation. To make a long story short, just to give some basic facts rather than giving a lengthy explanation. I met Sarah at the library and we decided to go to the club. And the last one. So finally, Corona became a pandemic throughout the country. So finally means eventually, consequently. And now let's do a quiz. Can you fill in the blank using these expressions? In China, where coronavirus was first discovered. The first one, it all started in China, where coronavirus was first discovered. My memory flooded back in an instant, and I remembered everything. We are continuing our story. What happened was, My memory flooded back in an instant and I remembered everything. The court case could not be won at all, as the prosecutor has so much evidence against us, adding another idea, another detail about their story. The other thing is, the court case could not be won at all, as the prosecutor has had so much evidence against us. As a recap, we use these expressions to begin a story. I never forget the time that I installed within. That reminds me of when I've got to tell you about. We use these expressions to continue a story, what happens, the next thing we know, so later on, and meanwhile we use these expressions to add more details or going back to a story. The thing you have to know is another idea. I forgot to mention that, referring back to another fact in our story. The other idea is, all there is to know about, the most important fact about is, an ending story to make a long story short, not to talk about, not giving lengthy explanations, and so finally, eventually. If you liked this video, hit the subscribe button to learn more of what I teach here. Until next video, so long.